Thomas Wilson had worked for Edward Bennett for 15 years. Bennett Financial was the pride of Pinellas County, a firm that had grown from a small office to a large building overlooking the bay. As Edward's trusted financial officer, Thomas believed they were helping local families build secure futures. Every morning, Thomas arrived at the office before everyone else. He loved the quiet moments when he could watch the sunrise over the water from the 12th floor windows. The cleaning staff knew him by name, and Mrs. Jenkins, who polished the wooden desks each dawn, always left a mint on his keyboard. "You work too hard, Mr. Wilson," she would say with a gentle smile. But Thomas didn't mind the long hours. He believed in what they were doing. Edward had built the company on trust, and their clients, teachers, police officers, nurses, and shopkeepers had entrusted their life savings to Bennett Financial. "We're building something important," Edward would often say, placing a friendly hand on Thomas's shoulder as they looked out at the water together. "People trust us with their life savings, their children's education funds, their retirements. That's sacred." Thomas had believed every word. Until Tuesday, April 14th. The day had started like any other. Thomas reviewed the quarterly reports while drinking his morning coffee from his favorite blue mug, a Father's Day gift from his daughter Emma. The numbers on page 7 caught his attention. A transfer that didn't match his records. Small, but unusual. Thomas frowned and pulled up the digital records on his computer. The transfer was there, but he had no memory of authorizing it. He checked the signature. It matched Edward's perfectly. "Probably just forgot to mention it," Thomas muttered to himself, but something felt wrong. He continued through the report, finding 3 more unusual transfers. All small, all authorized by Edward, all sent to an account Thomas didn't recognize. By lunchtime, Thomas had discovered 17 similar transfers over the past 3 months. Together, they added up to nearly £300,000. Not a fortune for a company their size, but enough to raise serious questions. Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he closed the report. He needed more information before approaching Edward. Perhaps there was a simple explanation, a new investment opportunity, or a special project. Over the next 3 days, Thomas dug deeper into the company's records. He worked late into the night, telling his wife Mary that he was preparing for an audit. The more he searched, the more his stomach knotted with dread. It wasn't just a few transfers. It was a pattern stretching back 8 years. Money moving from client accounts through a complex series of transfers and eventually disappearing into offshore accounts. Accounts that all seemed to link back to Edward himself. On Friday night, Thomas sat alone in his office, surrounded by printed reports and highlighted bank statements. The office was silent except for the hum of his computer and the occasional ping of the elevator in the hallway. The evidence before him told a story he couldn't bear to believe. Edward Bennett, his mentor and friend, had been stealing from their clients. Not small amounts, but millions. Nearly £50 million over the past decade. Thomas thought about Mrs. Parker, who came in every month to check on her account, money she needed for her husband's cancer treatments. He thought about the Taylor family, who had 3 children heading to university in the next few years. He thought about the retirement home in Clearwater, where over 100 elderly people depended on their investments with Bennett Financial. These weren't just numbers on papers. These were people's lives, their futures, their security. Thomas picked up the photo on his desk. His wife Mary, his son Jack, and his daughter Emma smiling back at him from a beach holiday last summer. What would they think if they knew? What would happen to them if he spoke up? The company would collapse. He would lose his job. Their friends would turn away. But if he stayed silent, more people would lose everything. Outside his window, the lights of the city sparkled against the darkness of the bay. The same view he had admired for 15 years now seemed cold and distant. Thomas gathered the evidence into a folder and placed it in his briefcase. His hands were steady now, though his heart raced with uncertainty. Monday morning, he would face Edward with the truth. Whatever happened after that, he would have to be ready. Thomas spent the weekend in a fog of worry. He checked and double-checked his findings, hoping to find a mistake that would explain everything. But the evidence only grew stronger. On Saturday, he took a long walk along the beach near his home, the sand cool between his toes, trying to clear his head. On Sunday, he sat silently during family dinner, barely touching Mary's roast beef. "Dad, are you okay?" Emma asked, her 16-year-old eyes sharp with concern. "Just work stress, sweetheart," he replied with a forced smile. Monday morning arrived with dark clouds threatening rain. Thomas dressed carefully in his best navy suit, the one Mary had helped him pick for important meetings. His tie felt too tight around his neck as he drove to the office. The folder of evidence sat heavy in his briefcase. Each page told part of the same terrible story: client accounts slowly drained, money moved through different companies, and finally sent to offshore accounts in places where banking laws were loose. In the office, Thomas nodded politely to co-workers as he made his way to Edward's corner office. Patricia, Edward's secretary, looked up with a bright smile. "Good morning, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Bennett isn't expecting you, but he's free until 10. "Thank you, Patricia," Thomas said, his mouth dry. "This won't take long." Edward was standing by his window, coffee in hand, looking out at the gray sky over the bay. At 58, he still looked fit and strong, his silver hair perfectly cut, his expensive suit without a wrinkle. He turned as Thomas entered, his smile warm and welcoming. "Thomas. Good morning. What brings you by so early?" Thomas closed the door behind him. "We need to talk, Edward." For a moment, they just looked at each other, Edward still smiling, Thomas struggling to keep his face calm. Then Thomas placed his briefcase on the large oak desk, opened it, and pulled out the folder. "I found some problems in the quarterly reports," Thomas said, his voice steadier than he expected. "Transfers that didn't make sense." Edward's smile didn't waver. "I'm sure there's a simple explanation." "I thought so too," Thomas replied, opening the folder. "But then I found more transfers. A lot more." He spread the papers across Edward's desk: bank statements, account records, transfer authorizations. All highlighted, all connected. "They trusted us, Edward," Thomas said, pointing to a list of affected client accounts. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice remained firm. "These are our neighbors, people who believed in us." Edward's smile finally faded. He looked at the papers, then back at Thomas. His face showed no guilt, no shame, only cold calculation. "It's business, Thomas. Sometimes there are losses. These aren't losses. They're people. Real people with real lives," Thomas said, heat rising in his voice. "Mrs. Parker is paying for her husband's cancer treatments. The Taylor family has 3 children going to university. The retirement home in Clearwater, there are over 100 elderly people whose accounts have been emptied." Edward sat down in his leather chair, sighing like a teacher disappointed with a student. "You've always been so emotional about things, Thomas. That's why you've never moved beyond where you are. Business requires tough decisions." "Stealing isn't a tough decision," Thomas said. "It's a crime." Edward's eyes hardened. "Be careful, Thomas. Think about what you're saying. Think about your family. Your mortgage. Emma's university plans. Jack's private school." The threat hung in the air between them. "Are you going to the authorities with this theory of yours?" Edward asked, his voice dangerously soft. Thomas hadn't decided yet. Part of him had hoped foolishly, he now realized, that Edward would explain, apologize, make it right. That hope was gone now. "I have copies of everything," Thomas said. "Digital and paper." Edward nodded slowly, then reached for his phone. "Patricia, please cancel my 10 o'clock. And hold all calls for the next hour." He looked back at Thomas. "Let's talk about this reasonably. Like businessmen." For the next 45 minutes, Edward offered everything: a raise, a promotion, a share of the money. When Thomas wouldn't budge, the offers turned to threats against his career, his reputation, his family. "No one will believe you over me," Edward said finally, his voice cold. "I've spent decades building relationships in this town. You'll be seen as a disgruntled employee trying to damage the company.
You'll never work in finance again. Thomas gathered his papers back into the folder. Maybe, he said quietly. But I'll still be able to look at myself in the mirror. As he walked out of Edward's office, Thomas felt a strange mixture of fear and relief. The choice ahead was clear now, but the path would not be easy that night. As Thomas drove home along the coastal road, the weight of his decision pressed down on him. Rain fell in heavy sheets, matching his dark mood. The wipers swept back and forth as his mind raced through his options. He couldn't ignore what he had found. But going to the authorities would mean destroying Bennett Financial. Hundreds of people would lose their jobs. The scandal would rock Pinellas County. And Edward's threats against his family weren't empty words. A man who could steal millions could certainly ruin a career. Thomas pulled into his driveway and sat in the car, watching the rain stream down the windshield. The kitchen light was on, and through the window he could see Mary moving about, preparing dinner. How could he tell her that everything they had built might soon come crashing down? When he finally entered the house, Mary took one look at his face and knew something was wrong. "What is it, love?" she asked, her kind eyes searching his face. Thomas took her hands in his. "I have to tell you something difficult," he said. "Something that might change everything for us." Over a cup of tea that grew cold as he spoke, Thomas explained what he had discovered. Mary listened without interrupting, her face growing paler with each detail. "So what will you do?" she asked when he finished. "I don't know," Thomas admitted. "If I go to the authorities, we could lose everything. Edward has powerful friends." Mary squeezed his hand. "And if you don't? Then I'm helping him steal from innocent people. People like us." They sat in silence for a long moment, the kitchen clock ticking loudly. "Then we'll face it together," Mary finally said, her voice warm with trust. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." That night, Thomas barely slept. He tossed and turned, going over his options again and again. By morning, he knew what he had to do. At breakfast, Jack and Emma sensed the tension between their parents. "Is everything okay?" Emma asked, looking worried. Thomas tried to smile. "Your mom and I have some things to figure out. But we'll be fine." After the children left for school, Thomas called in sick to work for the first time in 5 years. Then he made another call. To an old university friend who had become a detective with the Financial Crimes Unit. "Robert, I need your help," Thomas said when his friend answered. "And I need to know this will be handled properly." "What's this about, Tom?" Robert asked. "Fraud. Theft. A lot of money." "Come to the station," Robert said, his voice serious now. "We'll talk." 2 hours later, Thomas sat in a small interview room, his folder of evidence open on the table. Robert and another detective listened carefully as Thomas explained what he had found. Their faces grew grimmer with each detail. "This is big, Tom," Robert said when Thomas finished. "Really big. We'll need formal statements, and you'll have to be prepared to testify." "I understand," Thomas said quietly. "And you should know, once this starts, we can't control where it goes. If Bennett has been doing this for years, there might be others involved." Thomas nodded. He had considered this possibility. Some of his colleagues might have known or suspected something was wrong. Had they kept quiet out of fear, like he almost had? Or were they part of it? "One more thing," Robert added. "Bennett will know it was you who came forward. There's no hiding that. Are you prepared for what that means?" Thomas thought about his comfortable life, the house with the view of the bay, the holidays abroad, Emma's plans for university, Jack's private school. All of it built on his salary from Bennett Financial. All of it now at risk. But he also thought about Mrs. Parker, checking her account balance each month, counting on that money for her husband's treatments. He thought about the retired couples who had worked hard all their lives, trusting their savings to people they believed were honest. "Yes," he said firmly. "I'm prepared." As Thomas left the police station, his phone buzzed with a text from Edward. "Where are you? We need to talk." Thomas didn't reply.
Instead, he drove to the small cafe near the beach where he and Mary had their first date 20 years ago. She was waiting for him at their usual table by the window, 2 cups of coffee already ordered. "It's done," he told her, taking her hand across the table. Mary nodded, her eyes showing both fear and pride.
"Then we'll face whatever comes next."
Outside, the rain had stopped, and sunlight sparkled on the wet pavement. The storm had passed, but Thomas knew the true tempest was just beginning. The news broke 3 days later. Thomas was having breakfast with his family when his phone began to ring non-stop. The local news channel showed police officers escorting Edward from the Bennett Financial Building in handcuffs, his face stony with anger.
"Dad, isn't that Mr. Bennett?"
Jack asked, pointing at the television with his spoon.
Thomas nodded, unable to find words.
Mary reached across the table and squeezed his hand.
Within hours, the story was everywhere. Financial fraud rocks Pinellas County screamed the headlines. Bennett accused of stealing millions from clients.
Through it all, Thomas's name remained protected, listed only as a whistleblower within the company.
But that protection wouldn't last long. Robert called that afternoon.
"We've frozen Bennett's accounts, but most of the money is gone," he said grimly. "And Tom, he's talking. Saying it was all your idea, that you were the mastermind and he was in the dark." Thomas had expected this.
"He has no proof."
"No, but he has friends.
Powerful ones. This is going to get ugly before it gets better."
The next day, 2 officers arrived at Thomas's home with a formal request for him to come to the station. They were polite but firm.
More questions needed to be answered.
For the next week, Thomas spent his days in interview rooms, explaining the complex web of transactions again and again. Each night, he came home exhausted, the strain showing in the new lines on his face.
The company was placed under investigation. All employees were questioned.
Most were cleared quickly, but 3 senior managers were found to have helped Edward hide the fraud. They were arrested, their faces joining Edward's on the nightly news. Thomas's role as the whistleblower became public knowledge when a junior clerk at the police station leaked his name to the press. Overnight, his phone filled with messages, some supportive, others hateful. Reporters camped outside his house, shouting questions whenever anyone entered or left.
"How long did you know about the fraud, Mr. Wilson? Why did it take you 15 years to come forward? Did you profit from the scheme before turning on Mr. Bennett?"
The worst moment came when Thomas had to face the victims. The police organized a meeting at the community center for all affected clients. Thomas agreed to attend, though Mary begged him not to go.
"They'll blame you," she warned. "People need someone to be angry at."
"I should have seen it sooner," Thomas said. "They deserve to hear that from me." The community center was packed. Over 300 people filled the seats, their faces showing a mix of anger, grief, and shock. Detective Robert stood at the front, explaining what they knew so far: nearly £50 million stolen over 10 years, affecting more than 800 clients. When Thomas was introduced, a murmur ran through the crowd. He walked to the front on shaky legs, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him. "I worked with Edward Bennett for 15 years, he began, his voice cracking slightly.
"I trusted him. I believed in what we were doing. And I failed to see what was happening until it was too late." Angry shouts rose from the crowd. "My retirement is gone. How could you not know? You must have been part of it."
Thomas stood there, accepting their anger, knowing it came from pain. He had prepared for this, but the reality was harder than he imagined. Then, from the back of the room, a voice called out, "Let him speak." It was William Parker, whose wife needed expensive cancer treatments they could no longer afford. Thomas had met with the Parkers many times over the years, helping them plan their finances. A hush fell over the room as William made his way to the front. He stood beside Thomas, facing the crowd. "I know this man," William said firmly. "He's helped my family for years. If he says he didn't know, I believe him. And he's the one who brought this to light. Without him, Bennett might still be stealing from us." Thomas felt tears threatening to form in his eyes. He hadn't expected any support, especially from someone who had lost so much.
After the meeting, William approached Thomas privately.
"I wanted to hate you," William said quietly. "But I saw your face when you spoke."
"You didn't know, did you?"
Thomas shook his head, tears in his eyes.
"No. But I should have." William nodded slowly.
"What matters now is what we do next. The money's gone, but we're still here." As Thomas drove home that night, William's words echoed in his mind. What matters now is what we do next. For the first time since the nightmare began, Thomas felt a tiny spark of something like hope. The worst had happened, his career was in ruins, his reputation damaged, his family under stress, but he was still standing. And maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. 6 months passed. The legal case against Edward Bennett moved slowly through the courts.
Edward pleaded not guilty, but the evidence was strong.
3 of his managers turned against him, hoping for lighter sentences. The financial press called it the Bennett betrayal, the biggest fraud case in Pinellas County history.
For Thomas and his family, those months were hard.
He couldn't find work in finance, no company would take the risk. Mary took extra shifts at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. They sold their second car and canceled their summer holiday plans. The hardest part was watching the impact on the victims. The Parkers had to move in with their daughter when they couldn't afford their home anymore.
The Taylor family's oldest son had to delay university. The retirement home in Clearwater was forced to cut services for its residents.
Each story weighed on Thomas. Though he hadn't stolen the money, he felt responsible. He should have seen the signs earlier. He should have asked more questions.
Then one evening, William Parker called him. "Thomas, I've been thinking," William said. "We need to do something.
Not just for ourselves, but for everyone affected."
"What can we do?" Thomas asked. "The money's gone."
"Not all of it," William replied.
"The police found some of Bennett's hidden accounts.
And his houses and cars are being sold."
"It won't be enough, but it's something.
We need a plan to use what's recovered in the best way possible."
The next day, they met at a small cafe.
William brought 3 other victims with him, a retired teacher, a young couple who had lost their house deposit, and a small business owner who had invested his company's pension fund with Bennett. They talked for hours, sharing ideas. By the end of the meeting, the Pinellas Recovery Fund was born. In the weeks that followed, Thomas worked tirelessly. He contacted local businesses for support. He met with lawyers who offered free advice. He spoke with the police about the recovered assets. Slowly, a plan took shape. 6 months after Bennett Financial collapsed, Thomas stood before a crowd at the Pinellas County Community Center. The same room where he had faced anger now held a different energy, cautious hope. More than 200 former clients had come, along with local business owners, community leaders, and volunteers. "We can't change what happened," Thomas said, his voice carrying through the quiet room. "But we can rebuild together. Today, we're starting the Pinellas Recovery Fund." He explained the plan. The fund would use the recovered money from Edward's assets, about £8 million so far, to provide immediate help to those in the worst situations. The local credit union had agreed to offer special loans. Financial advisors were volunteering their time to help people rebuild their savings plans. "I've given my own savings as a start," Thomas continued. "It's not much, but it's what I can do. And local businesses have promised help." He pointed to a board at the back of the room where 20 local companies had pledged support, from the hardware store offering discounts to people affected by the fraud, to the supermarket chain providing food vouchers, to the local law firm handling cases for free. "I was blinded by trust," Thomas admitted. "But now I see clearly. This isn't just about money. It's about rebuilding faith in each other. About showing that for every person who breaks trust, there are hundreds more ready to stand up and make things right." As he looked at the faces before him, some still angry, others carefully hopeful, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt since the scandal broke: purpose. After the meeting, Mrs. Parker approached him, her eyes bright with tears. "William told me what you've been doing," she said. "Thank you. Not just for the fund, but for coming forward in the first place. That took courage. I just did what was right, Thomas replied. Sometimes that's the hardest thing to do, she said, patting his arm. As Thomas walked home that evening, the setting sun painted the bay in shades of gold and pink. He thought about how much had changed in a year. His comfortable life was gone. His career in finance was over. His family had faced stress and uncertainty. But something new was growing from the ashes. The recovery fund was helping people. Former clients were coming together to support each other. Local businesses were showing that Pinellas County was a community that looked after its own. Thomas knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. The fund couldn't make everyone whole, nothing could replace all that was lost. But with each family they helped, they would reclaim something more valuable than money, the belief that when people fall, others will be there to help them up again. For the first time in a long time, Thomas felt at peace with his choices. The worst storm of his life had passed, and though the damage was real, he had found a way to rebuild, not just for himself, but for everyone affected by Edward's betrayal.